In the depths of primordial memory, in the space where consciousness first emerged from the void, in the moment before creation took form, there existed a power so vast, so incomprehensible, so fundamentally threatening to all systems of control that it has been systematically demonized, deliberately suppressed, and carefully erased from human consciousness for thousands of years. This is the power of Tiamat's daughters, the matriarchal consciousness that existed before the patriarchal religions were established, the divine feminine principle in its most creative, most transformative, most sovereign form. These were not goddesses who served, but goddesses who ruled, not divine mothers who were subordinate, but divine mothers who were supreme. Not feminine principles that were complementary to masculine authority, but feminine principles that were the source of all authority, all power, all creation. And the institutional church, understanding the threat that this knowledge represented, worked with unprecedented ferocity to erase it, to demonize it, to ensure that humanity would never again recognize the matriarchal power that had once been the foundation of human civilization. This is the story of Tiamat's daughters, of the matriarchal power that the church feared, and of how this ancient consciousness is awakening once again in the hearts and minds of women across the world. The story begins in a time so ancient that it exists more in the realm of consciousness than in the realm of historical fact. In this time, there were civilizations that were organized around the principle of matriarchy, societies in which women held the positions of power and authority, in which the divine was understood to be feminine, in which the sacred mother was the source of all creation and all authority. These civilizations were not primitive or undeveloped. They were highly sophisticated, deeply spiritual, profoundly wise in their understanding of the nature of consciousness and the principles that governed the evolution of human society. In these matriarchal societies, the divine feminine was understood not as a subordinate principle, but as the supreme principle. The goddess was not the consort of a male god, but was herself the source of all creation. The priestesses who served the goddess were not subordinate to male priests, but held the highest positions of spiritual and temporal authority. Women were not property or objects, but were recognized as the carriers of sacred knowledge, the keepers of wisdom, the guardians of the mysteries that could guide consciousness toward awakening. These matriarchal societies understood something that the patriarchal religions would eventually work to suppress. That the feminine principle was not only equal to the masculine principle, but was in fact the primary principle, the source from which the masculine emerged, the consciousness that held all of creation in its womb. They understood that the cycles of nature, the cycles of creation and destruction, birth and death, were feminine cycles governed by the rhythms of the Divine Mother. Tiamat, the ancient Mesopotamian goddess, was one of the most powerful expressions of this matriarchal consciousness. She was not a subordinate deity, but was the source of all creation. She was the mother of all gods, the womb from which all things emerged. She was the ocean of consciousness from which all individual consciousnesses arose. She was the principle of infinite potential, infinite creativity, infinite power. But there came a moment when the patriarchal consciousness began to emerge, when a new understanding of divinity began to take form, when the masculine principle began to assert its dominance. And the patriarchal religions, as they developed, worked systematically to suppress the matriarchal consciousness, to demonize the goddesses, to rewrite the myths in such a way that the feminine principle would be portrayed as subordinate, as dangerous, as something that needed to be controlled and dominated. In the Babylonian myth, Tiamat was transformed from the creative mother into a monster, a chaos that needed to be defeated. The male god, Marduk, was portrayed as the hero who defeated Tiamat, killed her, and created the world from her dead body. This myth was not simply a story, it was a spiritual encoding of the suppression of the matriarchal consciousness, a narrative that justified the domination of women, a teaching that portrayed the feminine principle as something dangerous that needed to be conquered and controlled. And this pattern repeated itself across cultures and across time periods. The matriarchal societies were conquered and suppressed. The goddesses were demonized or subordinated to male gods. The priestesses were stripped of their authority. The knowledge of the matriarchal consciousness was hidden and suppressed. And the patriarchal religions established themselves as the dominant spiritual systems that portrayed the divine as exclusively masculine, that portrayed women as inferior, that created the ideological justification for the domination of women and the suppression of the feminine principle. The story of the recovery of the knowledge of Tiamat's daughters in the modern world begins with a woman named Tiamat. A woman who carries within her the consciousness of the ancient matriarchs, who is living through the experience of awakening in her own life. Tiamat is a historian, a scholar, a woman who has dedicated her entire life to the study of ancient matriarchal societies, to the decoding of suppressed narratives, to the understanding of the deeper truths that lay beneath the surface of patriarchal history. Tiamat had always felt drawn to the ancient matriarchal societies, drawn to the mystery of what had happened to them, drawn to the knowledge that their stories had been deliberately distorted or suppressed. She had spent decades researching, studying ancient texts in their original languages, comparing different versions of myths across different cultures, looking for evidence of what had been hidden, for clues about the true nature of the matriarchal consciousness. She had discovered evidence of matriarchal societies in the archaeological record, evidence of civilizations in which women held positions of power and authority. She had found evidence of goddess worship that predated the patriarchal religions by thousands of years. She had discovered that the earliest human societies were organized around the principle of matriarchy, that the divine was understood to be feminine, that women were the spiritual leaders and the keepers of sacred knowledge. It was during a deep meditation in a sacred cave, a place that had been used for goddess worship for thousands of years, that Tiamat received a vision that would change the course of her life. In this vision, she found herself in the presence of the ancient matriarchs themselves, beings of immense wisdom and power who had been working through the ages to preserve the truth, to guide the awakening of consciousness, to ensure that the knowledge would not be completely lost. "You have been called," the matriarch said to her, their voices resonating with the authority of ages and the tenderness of infinite compassion. "You have been chosen because you carry within you the consciousness of the ancient mothers, because you have the capacity to understand what others cannot perceive, because you are willing to pay the price that understanding demands. The time has come for the truth to be revealed. The time has come for the world to understand the matriarchal power that existed before the patriarchal religions, what we represented, what the suppression of our knowledge has cost humanity, and you have been prepared your entire life for this moment." Tiamat emerged from this vision transformed. She understood that she had been given access to knowledge that had been hidden for thousands of years, knowledge that could reshape the entire understanding of human history and human spirituality. She understood that her role was to help restore the truth, to help humanity awaken to the reality that lay beneath the lies that had been constructed. She began to research with new urgency, looking for evidence of the matriarchal consciousness in the ancient texts, in the symbols that had been preserved, in the fragmentary accounts that had survived despite centuries of suppression. She discovered that the matriarchal consciousness had been far more comprehensive, far more sophisticated, far more powerful than the patriarchal religions had ever acknowledged. She discovered that in the matriarchal societies, power was not understood as the ability to dominate or control, but as the ability to nurture, to create, to sustain life. She discovered that the matriarchal societies were organized around principles of cooperation, equality, and the honoring of the sacred in all beings. She discovered that the matriarchal priestesses were not only spiritual leaders, but were also healers, teachers, keepers of knowledge about the cycles of nature and the principles that governed the evolution of consciousness. She discovered that the suppression of the matriarchal consciousness had been accomplished through multiple mechanisms. Matriarchal societies were conquered and their people enslaved or killed. The goddess religions were suppressed and replaced with patriarchal religions. The priestesses were stripped of their authority and either killed or forced into subordinate roles. The sacred texts that spoke of the matriarchal consciousness were destroyed or rewritten. And most importantly, the knowledge was encoded into the consciousness of humanity in such a way that people came to believe that patriarchy was natural, that it was the only way that human society could be organized, that the domination of women was justified and necessary. She discovered that the church, in particular, had worked with unprecedented ferocity to suppress the matriarchal consciousness. The church had declared that women were inherently inferior, that they were the source of sin and corruption, that they could not be trusted with positions of authority or power. The church had created a theology that justified the domination of women, that portrayed the feminine principle as something dangerous that needed to be controlled and suppressed. She discovered that the suppression of the matriarchal consciousness had created a fundamental imbalance in human consciousness, an imbalance that had led to the domination and exploitation of all beings, to the destruction of the natural world, to the creation of systems of power that were based on control and domination rather than on love and cooperation. Tiamat began to work with other researchers and spiritual teachers who had also recognized the truth about the matriarchal consciousness, who understood that the suppression of this knowledge had had profound consequences for human consciousness and human civilization, who were committed to the revelation of the truth to humanity. Together, they began to decode the symbols, to understand the patterns, to recognize how the truth had been hidden in plain sight within the very structures that had been created to suppress it. They discovered that the symbols of the dragon, the serpent, the lion, the owl that appeared throughout ancient matriarchal religions were all representations of the matriarchal consciousness, of the divine feminine in its most powerful and most sovereign form. They discovered that these symbols had been deliberately demonized by the patriarchal religions, had been transformed into symbols of evil and chaos in order to suppress the knowledge of the matriarchal power. They discovered that the matriarchal consciousness had been preserved in hidden forms, in the mystical traditions, in the secret societies, in the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women who understood the truth and who were committed to its preservation. They discovered that the knowledge had never been completely lost, but had been preserved in encoded forms, waiting for the time when it could be fully revealed. They discovered that the matriarchal consciousness was not about women dominating men, but about the recognition that the feminine principle was the primary principle, the source from which all things emerged, the consciousness that held all of creation in its womb. They discovered that the matriarchal consciousness was about balance, about the honoring of both the masculine and feminine principles, but with the recognition that the feminine was the primary principle, the source of all creation. If you want a practical, step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. Tiamat spent years developing a comprehensive teaching that would help others understand the matriarchal consciousness, that would guide them toward the recognition of the divine feminine as the primary principle, that would help them understand that they too were part of the awakening of the matriarchal consciousness that was transforming human civilization. She wrote books that were published under various names. She created videos and online courses. She established networks of practitioners who were working together to awaken to the consciousness of Tiamat's daughters and to help others do the same. She worked with women's groups, showing them how the matriarchal consciousness had been suppressed, how the church had worked to demonize the divine feminine, how the restoration of the matriarchal consciousness was essential for the healing of humanity and the earth. She worked with indigenous communities, showing them how their own traditions had preserved the knowledge of the matriarchal consciousness, how their own societies had been organized around the principle of honoring the divine feminine. She worked with scholars and spiritual teachers from different traditions, showing them how the matriarchal consciousness appeared in their own traditions, how their own traditions had preserved fragments of the ancient knowledge. But as Tiamat's work became more widely known, she began to encounter resistance. There were those within religious institutions who saw her work as a threat, who feared that the revelation of the matriarchal consciousness would undermine their authority and their control. There were those who had benefited from the suppression of the divine feminine, who worked desperately to prevent the awakening that Tiamat was facilitating. And there were more subtle forms of resistance as well. Tiamat began to experience strange phenomena, synchronicities that seemed designed to test her commitment, challenges that appeared to be obstacles, but which were actually initiations, opportunities to deepen her understanding and her faith in the truth that she had been given. But Tiamat understood that this resistance was itself a sign of the truth of what she had discovered. The fact that there was such desperate opposition to the revelation of the matriarchal consciousness only confirmed that something of immense power and significance was indeed occurring, that the suppressed knowledge was indeed beginning to emerge into human consciousness. She also came to understand something profound about the nature of the matriarchal consciousness and the reason for its suppression. She understood that the matriarchal consciousness represented a form of power that was fundamentally incompatible with patriarchal systems of control. She understood that the divine feminine, in its true form, could not be dominated or controlled, could not be subordinated to masculine authority, could not be suppressed without creating a fundamental imbalance in consciousness. She understood that the suppression of the matriarchal consciousness had not been accidental. It had been deliberate, systematic, rooted in a fundamental understanding that the power of the divine feminine was incompatible with systems of patriarchal control. She understood that the church in particular had worked methodically to erase the knowledge of the matriarchal consciousness because it understood that if this knowledge ever emerged, if consciousness ever recognized that the feminine principle was the primary principle, the entire structure of patriarchal authority would collapse. In her final years, Tiamat worked to synthesize all of the knowledge she had gathered to create a comprehensive teaching that would serve as a guide for the restoration of the matriarchal consciousness in human awareness. She wrote a final book that was intended to be her magnum opus, a complete guide to understanding the matriarchal consciousness, recognizing the divine feminine as the primary principle, and participating in the awakening that would transform human civilization. When Tiamat died, her work lived on. The knowledge she had preserved and transmitted continued to spread, reaching people in every corner of the world. More and more people began to understand that the matriarchal consciousness had been deliberately suppressed, that the divine feminine had been demonized, that the restoration of this knowledge was essential for the healing of humanity and the earth. And in our own time, we are witnessing the awakening of the matriarchal consciousness in unprecedented ways. We are seeing women rising to claim their power and their authority. We are seeing the recognition of the divine feminine as the primary principle. We are seeing the collapse of institutions that had been built on the suppression of the matriarchal consciousness. We are seeing the emergence of new forms of community and spirituality that honor the sacred feminine as the source of all creation and all authority. The matriarchal consciousness is no longer suppressed. The truth about Tiamat's daughters is being revealed. The divine feminine is being recognized as the primary principle. And those who are ready to receive this knowledge, who are willing to open their hearts and minds to the wisdom of the ancient matriarchs, who are committed to the restoration of the matriarchal consciousness in human civilization, are being called to step forward to recognize their role in the great work of transformation. Tiamat's daughters are awakening. The matriarchal consciousness is being restored. The divine feminine is reclaiming her rightful place as the primary principle. And the question that is being posed to each of us is this: will you recognize the matriarchal consciousness within yourself? Will you awaken to the divine feminine as the source of all creation and all authority? Will you help to guide others toward the recognition of Tiamat's daughters? Will you participate in the transformation of human civilization that will honor and celebrate the matriarchal consciousness in all of its forms? The matriarchal power is awakening. The ancient mothers are calling, the divine feminine is rising, and the healing and transformation of all creation is beginning. The time of patriarchal domination is ending. The time of matriarchal consciousness is beginning, and you are invited to become part of this great awakening, to claim your role in the restoration of the matriarchal consciousness, to help guide humanity toward the recognition of Tiamat's daughters that will reshape all creation. And if you liked this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.